the Navy tidings, for which I call upon the House and the nation.
Dass wir intolerante, unverträgliche Menschen seien. Wir wollten sagen,
As September the 3rd and the second anniversary of the outbreak of World War II rapidly approached, the events of 1941 were gathering momentum. In Europe, the course of the conflict had veered dramatically as Adolf Hitler, after failing to invade the British Isles, turned his attention eastwards. On June 22, 1941, the Germans had invaded Russia as Hitler gave the order for Operation Barbarossa to commence. Anticipating a rapid victory by employing the blitzkrieg tactics that had seen Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries and France all fall to the Nazis, Hitler truly believed his troops would conquer the mighty Soviets before the onset of winter. It would prove to be a huge error of judgment, as the German Führer vastly underestimated the strength of his enemy. What's more, any hopes he had of his Japanese allies attacking Russia from the east as the Nazis advanced from the west were soon dashed, as the Empire of the Rising Sun became rather more preoccupied with their ongoing war with China and awakening a sleeping giant of their own, namely the United States of America. The months of July, August and September 1941 were set to become very interesting indeed, and as the world watched and waited to see what would happen next, it wasn't just the Soviet Union preparing to play Russian roulette. For many people looking back at the history of World War II, the position of the Russians in the events as they unfolded is often tricky to understand. Even Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, described Russia as being a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And as we look in depth at what was going on in July 41, stepping back further in time will certainly help us to understand matters more in context. Traditionally, as the 20th century dawned, the Russians had close ties with Great Britain, not least because the Tsar, Nicholas II, was married to Queen Victoria's granddaughter, Alexandra, and as another of Queen Victoria's grandchildren, the German Kaiser Wilhelm, threatened the peace of Europe, the Russians joined forces with the British when World War I began in 1914. But as the battlefields of Ypres and the Somme became soaked in the blood of the young men fighting in the trenches, the mighty Russian Empire was crumbling fast, and on the streets of Moscow, Russian blood was being spilled in equal measure. As World War I raged on, the Russian Revolution of 1917 saw the working classes rise up against their capitalist overlords, triggering a brutal civil war. With heavy losses to the Germans on the Eastern Front and deteriorating conditions on the home front, tensions ran high. The glittering decadence of the royal family was in stark contrast to the meagre existence of the peasant classes. And as Lenin came to fore as the Bolshevik leader, the Romanov dynasty was toppled as the Tsar and his family were captured and then executed. It was a desperate time for the people of Russia, who saw the rise of communism and the Red Army, named in honor of those whose blood had been shed in the war against capitalism. Then, when Lenin died in 1924, his place was taken by Joseph Stalin. Ironically, Lenin had warned against the threat that Stalin posed, but his wise words went unheeded. As far back as the 1920s, Winston Churchill could sum up a situation with the most telling of words, and a staunch opponent of communism, he declared that when it came to Lenin, for the people of Russia, their worst misfortune had been his birth, while the next worst was his death. It proved very much to be the case, as the Russians were left floundering without Lenin, and when Stalin came to power on human rights issues, there was little to choose between the new Soviet leader and Adolf Hitler. Stalin's Great Purge of the 1930s left the world and his own people in little doubt about what he was capable of. More accurately described as the Great Terror, Stalin launched a purge of the Communist Party to ensure he faced no opposition, just as Hitler was doing with his government in Nazi Germany. Those who had ever shown dissent were either sent to forced labor camps or executed, while millions of ethnic minorities were deported. Of the 5 first marshals of the Soviet Union, only 2 would survive the purge: Budyonny and Voroshilov, both of whom would have their part to play when the world went to war for a second time. With on average an estimated 1,000 executions of Russians a day, the Red Army became a fierce military machine, hardened by dogma and governed by terror, capable of committing the most dreadful atrocities without questioning orders. Although vehemently opposed to Stalin, Hitler had much in common with him, and when the German Führer realized he needed to secure Russian cooperation before invading Poland in 1939, despite hating communism with a vengeance, he made a pact with them that he had no intention of keeping. It was always going to be one of history's most uneasy pacts, and as we return to July 41, Hitler's cavalier abandonment of it may have come as little surprise to the Allies, but was a complete shock to the Soviets, despite the fact that they had been repeatedly warned about the imminent Nazi invasion by Allied intelligence. Further east again, though, events were taking place that were destined to have dramatic repercussions before the end of the year. On June 2nd, 1941, an imperial conference was held in Japan, as Hitler's most powerful ally evaluated their position. With Operation Barbarossa putting Russia and Germany at war, the Japanese were reluctant to be drawn into the conflict, as they had issues of their own that demanded more immediate attention. Japan had been at war with China since 1937, which was a major undertaking, but diplomatic tensions with the USA were also escalating. It's worthwhile at this point in the proceedings to recap on events to date from the Japanese perspective, so that it's possible to put what happened throughout the latter part of 1941 into context. The Japanese had a history of disputes with America and Russia, having spent many centuries of its existence with its ports closed to the outside world. It was a nation of great mystery. When the American naval commodore, Admiral Matthew Perry, finally forced the Japanese to open up trading links with the West as the 19th century drew to a close, the Empire of the Rising Sun without doubt felt they were being taken advantage of. What's more, with America buying the vast expanses of Alaska from the Russians and winning the Philippine Islands and Guam from the Spanish, Japan was all too aware of the growing dominance of the USA. Hawaii was also annexed, with the Americans creating a naval base there, from which they could easily reach their newly acquired territory in the Pacific. It will come as little surprise, therefore, that the Japanese took steps to improve their military power, modelling their army on the French and the Prussians, and their naval fleet on the British. This proved invaluable when Imperial Russia edged ever closer to Korea, a country Japan viewed as a safety buffer. When the Japanese Navy attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in 1904, they won a resounding victory. However, the new century was fast becoming diplomatically precarious, and just 10 years later, a melting pot of conflicts on a global scale had exploded into the First World War. After bitter and bloody fighting in the trenches and great battles at sea, when peace eventually prevailed in 1918, treaties were fast put in place to prevent such a war ever breaking out again. But just as the Treaty of Versailles and its draconian measures against the defeated German nation fired Adolf Hitler and other like-minded patriots into action, another treaty caused discontent for the Japanese. The strength of the largest naval powers in the world came under close scrutiny in the aftermath of World War I, and the Washington Naval Treaty was signed between America, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, agreeing limits for each signatory's navy. However, the Japanese felt they had been unfairly constrained by the Americans, and it was the start of a period of conflict between these two culturally diverse nations. Prince Fumimaro Konoe, who would eventually become Prime Minister of Japan, was skeptical of Western intentions at this time, and he was particularly concerned about the lack of natural resources available to his tiny island nation. Konoe believed that the nations in the West were protecting their own self-interests, and remarked that unless every country had equal access to international markets, the resource-poor nation of Japan would have no resort but to destroy the status quo for the sake of self-preservation. Within a decade, the fragile foundations of peace that the Treaty of Versailles had attempted to construct were under threat, and Konoe's predictions were to become reality. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent the world spiraling into an economic depression, and Japan was forced to look further afield for supplies of raw materials to feed the country's dying economy. There were already Japanese colonies in Manchuria in northeastern China, and tempted by a land rich in natural resources, the Imperial Army marched its troops into the region in September 1931. Within 6 months, a Japanese victory had been secured, and on March 1st, the last emperor of China, Puyi, who had been removed by Chinese warlords in 1924, was placed at the head of the new puppet state of Manchuria. The region itself was renamed Manchukuo, and soon the army began to draw up plans for settling 5 million colonists in China within 20 years. In the meantime, the new settlers set to work building mines for gold, coal, and iron ore, which would help fuel Japanese expansion. The timber industry thrived, and farmers were encouraged to grow opium poppies, the sale of which would help fund the imperial army. Before long, there was a dramatic increase in opium smoking, and soon a quarter of Manchuria's population were addicts. But while Japan reaped the benefits of their venture into China, their actions were condemned by the West. The League of Nations, set up after the First Great War to prevent further acts of aggression around the world, refused to recognize Manchukuo as an independent state and instructed Japan to pull out of the area. However, in February 1933, a Japanese delegate, Yosuke Matsuoka, responded to the representatives of nations from around the world, telling them that Manchuria was a matter of life or death for Japan.
It is a matter of common knowledge that Japan's policy is fundamentally inspired by a genuine desire to guarantee peace in the Far East and to contribute to the maintenance of peace throughout the world. Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
As Matsuoka marched from the hall, it marked Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations and the beginning of increasingly fraught relations with the West. By 1936, Japan had renounced the Washington Treaty. By 1937, after 6 years of sporadic battles, the conflict between China and Japan had escalated in size and intensity. On July 7th, as tensions heightened between the troops of the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek and the Imperial Army of Japan, an incident at Marco Polo Bridge to the south of Beijing led to full-scale war between the two countries. Beneath the watchful eye of the West, Japanese troops began to pour into China, led by the military leader Hideki Tojo, and were soon mercilessly ravaging the vast nation. There were many in Tokyo who were appalled that the army seemed to be pushing forward on their own initiative, and Prince Konoe, who had by now become Prime Minister of Japan, realized that his government had little or no control over the army. By December 1937, the Japanese army had reached the capital of China, Nanjing, launched a terrifying attack on its inhabitants that would see hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians massacred. There were Westerners in the city at the time who, like the Chinese, began to flee for their lives. And while the city was engulfed in chaos, one particular event would mark the beginning of even greater hostilities between Japan and America. Many military personnel and civilians had boarded the USS gunboat Panay to escape Nanjing, and on December 12, 1937, to the horror of those on board, Japanese naval planes began to dive towards the ship, bombarding it with explosives. While bomb blasts tore through the deck, many were injured and 3 Americans were killed. It was a grave moment for diplomatic relations between America and Japan, and to make matters worse, a newsreel of the event was soon on its way to President Roosevelt in Washington. With such an open demonstration of hostility, the American president had every reason to declare war. But while the memories of the First Great War still hung over the nation, the United States had been keen to take an isolationist stance and steer clear of conflict for the time being. Meanwhile, many of the Japanese had expressed their remorse for the incident. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto made a formal apology to the United States for the Panay incident. He was a Harvard man who had spent time as a naval attaché in America and was well aware of the considerable naval power that America yielded. He was also more aware than anyone else of the dangers of going to war with a nation as powerful as the United States. To the relief of the Japanese government, on Christmas Eve 1937, the president accepted the apology from Tokyo, but while the war continued in China, Roosevelt was increasingly disturbed by the tales of atrocities filtering back to the West. The Japanese military had little respect for human life, and their use of biological weapons and terror bombing was killing millions of civilians throughout China. After the Japanese firebombed Chongqing in May 1939, killing 5,000 people in 2 days, America made decisive moves towards preventing further Japanese brutality. In July that year, an embargo on the sale of aircraft to Japan was put in place and served as a warning to the country that America would do all it could to hinder its expansionist policies. By the time war had broken out in Europe, Roosevelt took further measures and by signing the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, promised aid not only for the British in their fight against Nazi Germany, but also for the Chinese as they battled against the Imperial Army. The leader of the Chinese National Front, Chiang Kai-shek, had also requested air support, and by the summer of '41, the first American volunteer group, popularly known as the Flying Tigers, were in training on Chinese airfields. Though the pilots would not be in combat until early '42, the fact that Roosevelt had approved their deployment was once again proof of where America's sympathies lay. Japan in turn made it clear that while war was waged in Europe, their sympathies lay with the Axis. In September 1940, they had signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Italy, and by the spring of '41, Frank Matsuoka, the delegate who had marched out of the League of Nations in 1933, was waving triumphantly from Mussolini's balcony in Rome. Matsuoka, who was by this time the Japanese foreign minister, had been educated in America and had lived there for 9 years. But despite his Western upbringing, Matsuoka was obsessed with the idea of an Anglo-American conspiracy aimed at Japan, and it was these fears which had drawn him closer to the belligerent nations of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. To the surprise of the Japanese government, the Japanese foreign minister did not stop at Italy and Germany, however, and on April 13, 1941, after a successful meeting with Joseph Stalin, he had signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union. It was certainly not what the Japanese government had expected, and officials were left bewildered by their foreign minister's radical new policy. Russia was Japan's hereditary enemy and had penetrated into the folklore of the people even before Commodore Perry's expedition in 1853 signaled the beginning of hostilities between East and West. Japan regarded Russia as the great power against which it was destined to fight for its survival, and it's worth looking back at one particular battle between Russia and Japan to better understand the rivalry that existed between the two nations. Barely 2 years before Matsuoka signed the neutrality pact with Stalin, there had been fierce battles between the Soviet Union and Japan. Mongolia, which bordered Japanese-owned Manchuria, had been a Soviet puppet state since the 1920s, and it seemed there was little hope of a peaceful coexistence between the two regions. The border between the two territories was hotly disputed, and while Japan claimed that the border ran along the Khalkhin-Gol River, the Soviets argued that it actually ran near Nomonhan village, some 10 miles east of the river. The argument continued throughout the 1930s, and there were frequent military clashes between Japanese troops and Mongolian and Soviet troops, but the most decisive engagement of the Soviet-Japanese border war would be the Battle of Khalkhin-Gol. In fact, this particular battle would also have a major significance in the history of the Second World War. By the spring of 1939, both the Soviet and Japanese nations had been building up forces on either side of the Khalkhin-Gol, and by July, Japanese troops had ventured across the river and were advancing along the west bank. They faced fierce opposition, however, led by a relatively unknown Soviet commander at the time. Georgy Zhukov was the son of a village cobbler and had led the life of a peasant until conscripted into the army. During the First World War, however, he proved his military expertise and was soon promoted to the rank of officer for his bravery in battle. Later, Zhukov joined the Bolshevik Party, where his background of poverty became a great asset, and he was one of the few officers who survived Stalin's Great Purge of the Red Army. Renowned for his detailed planning, discipline, and never-give-up attitude in battle, Zhukov would eventually become one of the greatest generals in the Soviet Union and certainly dissuaded the Japanese from ever picking a fight with the Soviets again. In August 1939, Zhukov launched his counterattack at Khalkhin-Gol with 50,000 Soviet and Mongolian troops and tank and motorized artillery divisions, which would prove more than a match for the Japanese. By the end of the month, the Northern Task Force had been completely destroyed, and while the surviving Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner, Zhukov was praised for his outstanding victory. By the time a ceasefire agreement was signed on September 15th, however, the Soviets had other matters to attend to. Stalin had new commitments in Eastern Europe, having agreed to take part in the Nazi invasion of Poland, and the Red Army was now drawn to an entirely different field of conflict. Just over 2 weeks after Hitler's initial invasion of the country, on September 17, 1939, the Soviets thundered into eastern Poland to the horror of those already battling against the German forces. Meanwhile, back in Japan, the events in Mongolia would have a profound effect on the politics of war. The Imperial Army had long favoured a North Strike group and had advocated marching deep into Siberia to further extend the Empire of Japan for years. In fact, propaganda had begun circulating as long ago as 1919, encouraging the Japanese to support the occupation of the Russian Far East. The Battle of Khalkhin-Gol, however, had changed matters somewhat. The disastrous defeat now convinced the Imperial General Staff in Tokyo that rather than following the North Strike group to extend the boundaries of the empire, they should instead focus on a South Strike group. This strategy, favoured by the Navy, would lead Japan to the rich territories of the South Pacific, where many outposts of the British Empire and the United States lay, and would ultimately change the course of the Second World War. In the meantime, by the summer of 1941, although the Soviets were assured that there was no longer a Japanese threat to their eastern borders, Hitler had renounced his non-aggression pact with the country, and there was a vast Axis army now crossing their southern borders. Hitler had waited many months for the opportunity to strike out at the evils of communism, and finally, by June 22, 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was well underway. The German armed forces were divided into 3 army groups, north, south and centre, and had the overall objective of reaching the Ural Mountains in the north and the Volga River in the south. Army Group North would march through the Baltics and either take or destroy the city of Leningrad, now known as St. Petersburg. This group would be commanded by Wilhelm von Lieb, a general disliked by Hitler for his anti-Nazi attitudes, but who had earned his place at the helm of Barbarossa after his great success during the Battle of France. Meanwhile, Army Group South would strike through the agricultural heartland of the Ukraine, taking Kiev before continuing eastward in the direction of Stalingrad on the Volga River and the oil-rich Caucasus. Group South would be led by Gerd von Rundstedt, who had seen action in Poland and France and had also helped plan the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. Feder van Bock, who had led an army into the north of Poland in 1939, would command Army Group Center, and it was Bock's army which would advance to Smolensk and then towards the glittering prize of Moscow. From a military perspective, there were a number of factors which made Moscow an important objective in the campaign against the Soviet Union. The city was the state capital, and its capture would not only disrupt the government, but would be hugely symbolic in the battle to conquer the country. Moscow was also a large industrial centre and an important hub in the Soviet railway network, which meant that if it was lost to the Nazis, links with the rest of the country would be cut off. Leningrad would be left vulnerable to the northwest, and Soviet contact would be severely weakened to the south, threatening the defense of the Ukraine. But while the Nazi generals were convinced that Moscow should be attacked first, Adolf Hitler believed that Leningrad should take priority over the Soviet capital. During the planning stages of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler, believing himself to be a military genius, had frequently ordered Leningrad first, the Donetsk Basin second, Moscow third, while his generals quietly harboured doubts about the capabilities of their Führer when it came to military strategy. But though the differences in opinion would eventually prove damaging to the campaign in Russia, the initial invasion was hugely successful. An Axis army of 3 million men swiftly broke Soviet defense lines, and while forces advanced more than 20 miles a day, by July, Army Group North had charged through the Baltic states, closing in on Leningrad. Army Group Center had encircled Minsk, and Army Group South was marching on Kiev. Stalin, in the meantime, sat in Moscow, paralyzed by the rapid advance of the enemy, still barely able to believe that Hitler had taken on the might of the Soviet Union. It took almost 2 weeks for the Soviet dictator to resume control, but finally, on July 3rd, the disorganized forces of the Red Army were given direction as Stalin addressed the entire country and called for a great patriotic war against the invader. In his speech, he appealed not only to communist ideals, but to Russian nationalism, and as the Soviet people heard the voice of their leader for the first time, soldiers and civilians alike rallied to defend their country. On July 10th, the Soviet Defense Forces were reorganized into a three-group command structure. Kliment Voroshilov, who had led the Red Army to disaster in the Winter War against Poland, was designated the Northwest Force. Semyon Timoshenko, who had fought with considerably greater success in Finland, was assigned the West Force, and Semyon Budyonny was assigned the Southwest Forces. Budyonny was one of the two first marshals of the Soviet Union to survive the Great Purge of the 1930s, along with Voroshilov. Zhukov, in the meantime, had been promoted to Chief of Staff and would coordinate the defense of the Soviet Union. Since Russian officers lacked the expertise or authority to direct large-scale operations, the Soviet groups would be nothing like the German army groups. However, they soon began to put up fierce resistance to the invading forces. In the meantime, just 4 weeks into the campaign, problems were beginning to arise in the Nazi advance. Bock's Army Group Center had managed to seize Smolensk by July 15th, but the panzer units were further ahead of the infantry than had been expected. Hitler had hoped that Soviet troops could be trapped using a huge pincer movement to the north and south of Smolensk, but while German motorized forces had raced ahead of the pursuing infantry, there was a noticeable strain on German supply lines. The gap between the two armoured pincers was unable to close until it was too late, and thousands of Soviet soldiers had escaped. There were now fears that the Russians might push reinforcements between the panzers of Army Group Center and their supporting units, and while Army Group South was encountering problems on its way to Kiev with heavier opposition than expected, Hitler made a radical decision. To the dismay of the commanders in the Central Army Group, Hitler decided to halt the advance on Moscow and focus all military strength on the attack on Kiev to the south and Leningrad to the north. On July 19th, Hitler issued Directive 33, instructing panzers from the Central Army Force to join Rundstedt's troops to the south. The plan was not popular with the German Army High Command, and in the following weeks there were many meetings to debate the issue. From mid-July to mid-August, the discussions would continue, and as time slowly slipped away, the Germans were wasting the most favourable weather for the war on Russia. While the debate continued, Stalin, wary of the great threat to the Soviet cities, now turned to Winston Churchill for assistance and suggested the British open a war front in the West by attacking France. But although the Nazi bombardment of the British Isles had eased by now, Churchill was in no position to help the Soviets fight their battles. And he reminded Stalin that Britain had been alone in the fight against the Axis for 1 year. British resources were stretched to full capacity, with battles continuing in Africa and the Atlantic. German troops led by Rommel continued to batter Allied defences as they pressed on towards Egypt and the precious Suez Canal. And while the Royal Navy focused their energies on protecting supply ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean, there were growing concerns for the unprotected outposts of the British Empire in the Pacific. Malaya, Burma, Singapore and Hong Kong were all precious British colonies, and these lay vulnerable to attack, while Japan remained allied with Germany. The Japanese had already put pressure on Britain to close the Burma Road, one of the few routes left open to deliver aid to China. And it was clear that as the war continued against Germany, the might of the British Empire was diminishing considerably in the region. The Japanese, in the meantime, remained skeptical about their alliance with Adolf Hitler. As a member of the Tripartite Pact, Japanese politicians had been shocked that Germany had not informed them of the attack on the Soviet Union, which put them in an awkward position after their agreement with Stalin. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, however, was quick to side with Hitler and, dismissing his earlier treaty with the Soviet leader, now urged Japan to go to war with Russia from the east as Germany advanced across its borders from the west. The government were by now exasperated with their foreign minister and keen to be rid of him, so Prime Minister Konoe, along with the entire cabinet, resigned in July 1941 to be reformed into a new government without him. But although Matsuoka's absence was a relief to many in Tokyo, Konoe was wary that Japan was moving rapidly towards the brink of a war which would soon be unavoidable. The Eastern Empire had already been spreading propaganda in support of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere to rally support for its venture to the South Pacific. The government claimed that this enterprise would place the people of Southeast Asia and China under the protection of Japan. Western empires had long taken advantage of the wealth of the Pacific, and Japan would now free Asia from European and American imperialism. But while those in the Pacific Islands began to truly believe that the Empire of the Rising Sun would be their salvation, the co-prosperity sphere was no more than an excuse for aggressive military expansion. In early July, American intelligence picked up a message from an imperial conference held in Japan, which stated that preparation for a southward advance should be reinforced, and by July 18th, it was clear that Japan was preparing to venture further afield. Their first target would be part of the French colonial empire, French Indochina, which included a large part of Vietnam, as well as Cambodia and Laos, and had been administered by the pro-Axis Vichy regime after the fall of France in 1940. The Japanese had been making demands on Indochina for months, but finally Vichy officials gave in to pressure and reluctantly signed a treaty with the belligerents on July 24th, allowing them to occupy air bases in the south of the country. This now placed the Japanese within easy reach of British colonies and American military bases. Meanwhile, as the threat of a Japanese attack in the east began to grow, Roosevelt made another bold move in the economic war he was waging on Japan, placing an embargo on Japanese trade in oil and steel. Giving Japan an ultimatum to withdraw entirely from China and from Indochina and to renounce its treaty with Germany and Italy, the embargo took effect from August the 1st. The British Empire and the Dutch in Indonesia swiftly followed suit, and the Japanese, who had traditionally been dependent upon the West for vital strategic raw materials, now faced a global embargo which would have devastating consequences on their economy. Japan had only stored enough oil for 2 years, and with no hope of replenishing these stocks from America, the chief of the Imperial Japanese Naval General Staff, Osami Nagano, announced that there was no choice left but to fight in order to break the iron fetters strangling Japan. He was adamant that if Japan were to go to war, it should do so quickly. As the Japanese High Command formally endorsed the Go South strategy to strike the weakly defended islands of the Pacific, on August 4th, battleship Prince of Wales and set off to meet President Roosevelt in Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, to discuss the situation in Europe and the Pacific. On August 9th, the two leaders met for the very first time. During this encounter, they would create a draft of documents which set goals for the post-war world. The Atlantic Charter advocated freedom from want and fear, the disarmament of aggressor nations, and global economic cooperation. It was indeed the first step towards the creation of the United Nations, but while the British and Americans celebrated their quiet alliance against the Axis, to the Japanese, the Atlantic Charter may as well have been a declaration of war and was considered a blueprint for Anglo-American world domination. An imperial conference on September 6th concluded that unless negotiations resolved the issue of oil supplies, hostilities would commence against the United States, the Netherlands, and Great Britain by mid-October. The Japanese Navy had already begun preparations for war, and Admiral Yamamoto, who had been eager to avert conflict with America back in 1937, had concluded that if war was truly unavoidable, the only way to succeed against the immense naval forces of the country was to attack the American fleet before it reached the Far East. Spies in Hawaii had been sending information back from the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, so the attack plan could be perfected, and while the United States focused on increasing forces and defending their bases in the Pacific, it seemed they had little idea of the risks closer to home. In the meantime, there were some in the Japanese government who were still reluctant to go to war with America. The Prime Minister Konoe urged a meeting with President Roosevelt so matters could be negotiated, even offering to travel as far as Hawaii at a moment's notice. But until Japan accepted the ultimatum set, Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, concluded that there was little reason for the two leaders to meet. As events gathered pace in the Pacific and Japan stood poised for war, in Russia, the pause for debate that had caused delay in the German offensive had finally ended. Hitler had refused to back down in the face of military opposition to his plans, and as the panzers of the Centre Army Group now moved south to meet Rundstedt's army advancing on Kiev, by August 23rd the attack had resumed. By September 19th, Kiev had fallen to the Nazis, and 4 Russian armies were surrounded in what is now considered the largest encirclement of troops in history. According to German claims, 600,000 Soviet troops were captured in an unprecedented defeat for the Red Army. Left to the mercy of the Nazis, the fate of many of these men would be worse than death, as they were sent to Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany. This was one of the largest camps the Nazis had built, and its prisoners would suffer unimaginable horrors as they now faced starvation, summary executions, or human experimentation. Of all the prisoners at Buchenwald, the Russians would be treated particularly badly, as, in Hitler's opinion, they were a subhuman race which should be wiped off the face of the earth. The loss of so many Soviet troops as Kiev fell would be disastrous for the Red Army, and as the Nazis made headway in the northeast, there was now the added danger that Leningrad would be lost. The Nazi general leading Army Group North, had received tank support from Army Group Center as well. By the end of August, the 4th Panzer Army had broken through Soviet defences and was within 30 miles of Leningrad. Meanwhile, the Finnish army closed in from the north around Lake Ladoga. The soldiers of Finland played an important part in the success of the campaign on Leningrad, and on September 6th, Baron Mannerheim, Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Defence Forces, received the Order of the Iron Cross from Hitler for his command in the campaign. However, when urged to continue the attack on Leningrad, Mannerheim and the Finnish government were reluctant to commit themselves fully to an Axis war and declined. Their aim had been to gain more territories in the east and reclaim land lost to the Soviets during the Winter War of 1939-40, not to capture Leningrad. But even without the aid of the Finns, Leningrad's fate already appeared to be sealed. The Soviet city, which stood on the Neva River at the head of the Gulf of Finland, was one of the most precious cities in Russia, and Hitler was eager to destroy it and annihilate everyone within it. German forces surrounded the city, cutting off all supply routes to Leningrad, and facing defences organised by Marshal Zhukov, began to lay siege to the city. In the chaos of the first months of war, no evacuation plan had been prepared for the inhabitants of Leningrad, and as food supplies diminished, soon hundreds of thousands of people were dying of starvation. People were reduced to eating anything they could find, and in some cases, some even reverted to cannibalism. On September 22nd, Hitler announced, "We have no interest in saving lives of the civilian population," and ordered that the city be erased from the face of the earth. The siege would continue for 872 days, and by the end of this time, over 1 million people would have died in Leningrad. With both Kiev and Leningrad facing destruction by the Nazis, by the end of September, Hitler ordered the advance on Moscow to commence, declaring, "After 3 months of preparations, we finally have the possibility to crush our enemy before the winter comes." But while the Soviets continued to stand their ground and the first snow had begun to fall on the Eastern Front, a German victory over the Soviet Union was still a long way off. The bitter Russian winter would promise disaster for Hitler's war on communism, and the battle that the Nazis had hoped would be over within months was only just beginning. In the meantime, as Japan's deadline to end negotiations with America approached, it seemed that the winter of 1941 would see the most dramatic turn of events in the Second World War to date.